The judge and the corporation counsel did not take her seriously, interrupting her and mocking her. But when she began to speak, the atmosphere in the room changed. One question turned the whole proceedings upside down, and those who had been laughing suddenly fell silent. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories, and write in the comments where you're watching from. Malia Obama had never stepped into a courtroom as a lawyer. She had never passed the bar exam, never spent sleepless nights preparing defense strategies, never argued in front of a jury. Her world had always been different: journalism, documentary filmmaking, investigative research. She sought the truth in stories, exposing hidden injustices with a camera instead of legal briefs. But today, she wasn't in a film studio. She was sitting at the defendant's table in a packed courtroom, her hands folded neatly in front of her, waiting for the proceedings to begin. Her presence had already unsettled the room. Reporters whispered to one another, some discreetly glancing her way, others openly taking notes. The judge, an older white man named Thomas Randolph, adjusted his glasses and let out a slow breath as if already exasperated by the day ahead. Across the aisle, the opposing counsel, James Whitmore, sat with an easy smirk, the type of man who thrived on theatrics and ego. He had no doubt about how today would end. The case itself seemed straightforward, but too straightforward. Janice Harper, an African-American woman in her mid-40s, had been terminated from her managerial position at Redmond Industries without cause. The corporation claimed at-will employment, but her contract explicitly stated that termination could only occur with documented evidence of misconduct. No such evidence had been presented. By legal standards, it should have been a cut-and-dry breach of contract. But Redmond Industries wasn't just any company. It was one of the city's most influential employers, with deep pockets and even deeper connections. The moment Janice filed a lawsuit, the corporation deployed an army of lawyers, pushing for the case to be dismissed before it even reached trial. When that failed, they ensured it landed in Randolph's courtroom. Judge Randolph had a long history of ruling in favor of corporations. His reputation for dismissing discrimination cases was well documented, though never explicitly stated. He was careful, never openly prejudiced, never blatantly biased. Instead, he undermined cases with technicalities, suppressing evidence, striking down key arguments under the guise of legal procedure. Everyone in the legal community knew what was coming. Janice's attorney, Lauren Brooks, had prepared as best as she could, but she wasn't naive. She'd understood the kind of battle she was walking into. That was why she had reached out to Malia. The call had come late at night, Lauren's voice tight with frustration but controlled. She laid out the details quickly. Redmond's lawyers were stalling, the judge was clearly leaning against them, and the case was slipping out of her grasp. She needed help. Not legal help, but something just as important. Strategy. Someone who could anticipate their opponent's next move, counter the subtle manipulation happening in the courtroom, and turn public attention to the case. Malia hesitated. She wasn't a lawyer. She didn't belong in a courtroom, but she knew the system. She had seen it up close, understood its flaws, its games, the way power was wielded behind closed doors. And she knew that if she didn't step in, this case would vanish like so many others before it. The next morning, she was in Lauren's office, poring over every detail of the case. She read through Janice's contract, highlighting key clauses. She reviewed past cases Judge Randolph had ruled on, analyzing his patterns. She studied James Whitmore's trial history, noting his tendencies, his habit of appealing to the judge's ego, his tendency to dismiss opposing arguments as irrelevant distractions. She mapped out every move before stepping foot into the courtroom. Now, as the bailiff called the court to order, Malia kept her posture straight, her expression unreadable. She could already feel the scrutiny. The courtroom wasn't just watching Janice's case. They were watching her. The daughter of a former president, someone who had never practiced law, now sitting in a legal battle against a powerhouse corporation. Judge Randolph cleared his throat, flipping through his notes before finally looking up. His eyes landed on Malia, lingering a beat too long before he turned to Lauren. "Counselor Brooks," he said, his tone neutral but edged with something else, mild condescension. "Shall we begin?" Lauren nodded, standing confidently despite the weight of the odds stacked against her. Malia said nothing. Not yet. She just watched, listened. The battle had begun. The courtroom was thick with an unspoken energy, the kind that settled in places where power had already made its decision before the first argument had even been spoken. Judge Randolph leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping idly against the wooden bench as Lauren Brooks began her opening statements. Her voice was steady, measured, every word carefully chosen to emphasize not just the legality of the case, but its moral weight. Malia could see the subtle shifts in expression across the room, some in the gallery nodding along, others smirking as if already convinced this was a futile exercise. From the very first sentence, the judge's attitude was clear. He allowed Lauren to speak, but with an air of impatience, as though she were wasting the court's time. When she presented the terms of Janice Harper's contract outlining the explicit clause that prohibited termination without documented cause, Randolph barely reacted. When she pointed out that Redmond Industries had failed to provide any such documentation, he let out a long breath through his nose, a slight shake of the head betraying his disinterest. Then came the interruptions. Lauren had barely begun citing a legal precedent when the judge raised a hand. "Counselor, let's not turn this into a law lecture," he said, his tone patronizing. A few quiet chuckles rippled through the gallery. Malia caught Whitmore smirking, his hands folded neatly on the table as if he were merely waiting for the inevitable dismissal of this case. Lauren adjusted her stance, unfazed. She continued, undeterred by the attempt to diminish her argument. She spoke about the importance of contract enforcement, about how allowing Redmond Industries to violate their own agreement set a dangerous precedent for employees across the state. Randolph interrupted again. "Miss Brooks, I trust you are aware that at-will employment is the default in this state?" Lauren's jaw tightened slightly, though she remained composed. "I am, Your Honor, but as I was explaining, when—" "I'm just making sure," he said, cutting her off again. He turned to Whitmore with an exaggerated sigh. "Counselor Whitmore, would you care to remind us all what at-will employment means?" The invitation was unnecessary. Everyone in the room knew that Whitmore had already prepared his speech, but this wasn't about legal definitions. It was about control. It was about reminding Lauren, and by extension Malia and Janice, that this courtroom was not theirs. Whitmore stood with an ease that made it seem as though he had already won. His voice was smooth, filled with the effortless confidence of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. He spoke of employer rights, of business efficiency, of the dangers of limiting a company's ability to make personnel decisions. He framed Redmond Industries not as a corporation exploiting a worker, but as a business protecting its ability to function without interference. When he finished, the judge nodded in approval. "Well said, Counselor." Malia's fingers curled slightly against the polished wood of the table. It was a performance. a carefully choreographed routine between a judge and an attorney who knew exactly how to tilt the scales in their favor. It wasn't about the law. It was about perception, about optics, about ensuring that Lauren and her client were always on the defensive. Lauren, to her credit, refused to be rattled. She continued pressing her case, presenting legal precedents that supported Janice Harper's claim. But every step of the way, the judge threw obstacles in her path. He dismissed certain arguments as irrelevant. He claimed one of her cases was not applicable, despite clear similarities. He allowed Whitmore to object freely, but shut down Lauren's objections before she could finish making them. The pattern was undeniable, and the gallery saw it. Malia could feel the shift in the room. At first, many of the observers had been content to watch with detached amusement, as though this was just another case of an idealistic young attorney biting off more than she could chew. But as the judge's bias became more blatant, some of that amusement turned into discomfort. A few legal interns in the back exchanged quiet glances. A court reporter, usually emotionless, briefly lifted her head, taking in the scene with sharper attention. Even some of the corporate representatives sitting behind Whitmore seemed aware that the balance had tipped too far. It was working against them. Randolph was overplaying his hand. The more he tried to undermine Lauren, the more obvious it became that he wasn't simply following legal procedure. He was actively trying to push the case in a predetermined direction, and that was when Malia decided it was time to step in. She had remained silent throughout the proceedings, observing, calculating. She knew that the moment she spoke, all eyes would turn to her, not just because of what she was saying, but because of who she was. Her last name carried weight. It carried expectation, and it carried the guarantee that, whether the judge liked it or not, people would be watching. So she waited until Whitmore, emboldened by the judge's support, tried to summarize the case as if it were already decided. He turned toward Janice Harper, barely acknowledging her as a person, reducing her claim to a misunderstanding of corporate policy. And then Malia spoke. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't deliver some grand speech. She simply addressed the judge with calm, calculated precision. The courtroom stilled. The moment she opened her mouth, the energy shifted. It was subtle at first. A few heads turned, a few observers straightened in their seats. The judge's fingers, which had been lazily tapping against the bench, suddenly stopped. Whitmore's smirk faltered just slightly, just enough to tell Malia that he had assumed she wouldn't actually engage. She laid out her argument with efficiency, dismantling the notion that at-will employment overrode explicit contract terms. She cited cases that Randolph himself had ruled on, forcing him to acknowledge his own legal history. And for the first time since the proceedings began, the judge didn't interrupt. Not because he didn't want to, because he couldn't, because Malia was quoting him. The gallery noticed. The interns, the reporters, even some of the corporate representatives, everyone was watching him now, waiting to see how he would respond. Randolph shifted in his seat, exhaling sharply through his nose. "Miss Obama," he said finally, his voice carefully neutral, "I see you've come prepared." Malia didn't react. She didn't need to, because for the first time in this case, she wasn't the one on the defensive, and she wasn't going to let them take back control. The silence in the courtroom stretched a beat too long. Judge Randolph, for all his experience, was caught off guard. He had spent years presiding over cases like this, years reinforcing the same unspoken rules, rules that favored the powerful, rules that kept certain voices quiet. But now, with Malia Obama standing before him, the weight of her argument pressing against the pretense of impartiality he had so carefully maintained. Those rules were beginning to crack. James Whitmore, usually composed and effortlessly confident, shifted in his chair. The smirk he had worn since the start of the trial had tightened at the corners, not quite slipping, but no longer as sure. He had expected a routine victory. He had expected Lauren Brooks to put up a noble fight before ultimately being dismissed. He had not expected her. Malia remained still, her expression unreadable. She had no intention of making this personal, but she had studied men like Randolph, men like Whitmore. They thrived on control, on the illusion of superiority. They used dismissiveness as a weapon, chipping away at the confidence of their opponents until even the strongest arguments seemed fragile. But she had spent years in rooms filled with men who underestimated her, who mistook her calm for uncertainty, who thought her presence was a novelty rather than a force. She had learned to let them talk themselves into corners. She wasn't going to give them an easy way out. Judge Randolph finally cleared his throat, his grip on the gavel tightening just slightly. "Miss Obama," he said, measuring his tone, as if deciding just how much patience he was willing to extend to her. "While I appreciate the enthusiasm, I would remind you that this is a court of law, not a—" Malia didn't flinch. "Your Honor, I'm fully aware of where I am." The statement was simple, but the way she delivered it left no room for condescension. A few quiet murmurs passed through the gallery. She could feel a shift happening. The same observers who had chuckled at the judge's earlier dismissiveness were now paying closer attention. Whitmore leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "Your Honor," he interjected smoothly, "while I respect Miss Obama's engagement in these proceedings, I must say this is highly irregular. As far as I'm aware, she is not an attorney of record in this case." Malia turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze for the first time. She could see what he was doing, framing her presence as inappropriate, implying that she was overstepping, that she didn't belong here. But he had made a mistake. He had acknowledged her. She let the pause hang for just a second longer than necessary before speaking. "I may not be an attorney," she said evenly, "but I am someone who has thoroughly reviewed the legal precedents in this case. And as I just cited, those precedents, including rulings made by this very court, contradict the claim that at-will employment nullifies explicit contract terms." Whitmore's smile barely faltered, but Malia saw the way his fingers flexed against the table. He was irritated. Good. Judge Randolph exhaled sharply, tapping his gavel once, not a reprimand, but a signal that he was reclaiming control of the room. "That may be, Miss Obama," he said, his voice more clipped now, "but let's not lose sight of the bigger picture. Case law can be interpreted in many ways. Surely, you're not suggesting that a handful of precedents override the fundamental principles of employer discretion." There it was, the setup. He wanted her to overreach, to make a sweeping argument that he could dismantle with ease. It was an old tactic, a way to make careful logic seem reckless, to twist facts into overstatements. She didn't take the bait. "No, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady. "I'm suggesting that employer discretion is not absolute, and that in this case Redmond Industries voluntarily imposed limitations on that discretion through a legally binding contract." Another shift. The energy in the room was changing. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough. Enough that some of the legal interns in the gallery were exchanging glances, scribbling notes, realizing that what they were witnessing was not the predictable trial they had expected. Whitmore recovered quickly, shaking his head with an easy chuckle. "Miss Obama," he said, You're arguing as though this is a case of blatant contract violation when, in reality, it's a question of interpretation." Malia raised an eyebrow. "If that were true, then I assume Redmond Industries has documentation proving that the termination met the contractual requirements." The air in the courtroom tightened. Whitmore's expression barely flickered, but it was enough. Malia had already gone through every document filed in this case. She knew what was there. More importantly, she knew what wasn't there. Judge Randolph shifted, his lips pressing into a thin line. He recognized the trap. He knew that if he dismissed this point outright, he would be confirming what everyone in the room was beginning to suspect, that he wasn't just ruling on legal grounds. He was playing defense for a corporation that hadn't covered its tracks well enough. A long silence stretched across the courtroom. Whitmore reached for his notes, scanning them as though an answer would suddenly appear. It wouldn't. Malia let him sit in that silence. She didn't press further. She didn't need to. The damage was already done. Judge Randolph inhaled through his nose, glancing down at the docket in front of him. "Miss Obama," he said finally, his voice measured, "I must admit you've done your homework." The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. Some of the younger attorneys in the back were nodding now, recognizing that the trial had just taken an unexpected turn. Whitmore adjusted his tie. His shoulders had squared slightly, his posture no longer as relaxed. He was realizing that this was no longer the one-sided trial he had anticipated. Malia remained still. She knew better than to celebrate too soon. This wasn't the victory. This was just the beginning of the fight. The tension in the courtroom had shifted. It was no longer just an exercise in routine corporate defense, no longer a scripted exchange between a judge and a high-powered attorney expecting an easy win. There was a new weight to the proceedings, a pressure that had settled over the room the moment Malia Obama forced the issue that no one had wanted to confront: the missing documentation. Whitmore straightened his papers as if searching for something, but everyone knew there was nothing to find. He was buying time, stalling, waiting for a break in the momentum that would let him regain control. Judge Randolph had gone silent, his fingers now resting against his chin, his expression unreadable. He had been forced into a position he did not want to be in, one where ignoring the obvious would be a risk rather than a convenience. Malia could feel the shift, but she didn't move, didn't react beyond what was necessary. A premature victory lap would give them an opening to dismiss her as arrogant, overconfident, unprofessional. Instead, she maintained the same measured poise she had carried since the moment she entered the courtroom. Judge Randolph finally exhaled and turned to Whitmore. "Counselor, the defense has raised a valid concern. If Redmond Industries maintains that the termination was in accordance with company policy, then surely they have the documentation to support that claim." It was a carefully worded statement, not an admission of fault, but an invitation for Whitmore to provide an explanation. A lifeline, if he could grab it. Whitmore's smile was tight, but still there. "Your Honor, as I stated earlier, at-will employment allows an employer the discretion to terminate an employee for any reason not protected by law. There is no legal requirement for them to justify their decision beyond the broad allowances granted under state labor codes." Malia didn't need to look at Lauren to know she was thinking the same thing. Whitmore was sidestepping. He wasn't answering the question. She let the silence hang for a moment before responding, careful to keep her tone neutral. "That's true, Counselor, but in this case, the company itself imposed a requirement beyond at-will employment. Their contract states that termination must be based on substantiated cause with supporting documentation. Are you saying that requirement was ignored?" The words were clinical, detached, but in the room they landed with force. Some of the gallery members who had come to witness a simple trial were now fully engaged. Even the legal interns had stopped their quiet note-passing, their eyes flickering between Whitmore and the judge, waiting for a response. Whitmore hesitated for half a second, just long enough for Malia to know that she had struck exactly where she needed to. Then he exhaled through his nose, setting his papers down with exaggerated patience. "Your Honor, we are getting tangled in unnecessary technicalities. The intent of the contract," Randolph held up a hand. The interruption wasn't sharp, but it was firm. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Counselor. I would like a direct answer to the question." Whitmore clenched his jaw for the briefest moment before relaxing again. His voice was smooth when he finally spoke, but there was an edge beneath it. "At this time, Your Honor, the plaintiff does not have additional documentation beyond what has already been submitted to the court." A ripple went through the gallery, small but undeniable. Malia didn't let her expression shift, but she felt it. The subtle confirmation of what she already knew. The company had no proof, no records, no formal justification for the decision they made. Judge Randolph's lips pressed into a thin line, his fingers tapping lightly against the bench. This was a problem for him. A bigger problem than he had anticipated. If Redmond Industries had provided the necessary paperwork, he could have ruled in their favor easily, citing precedent, procedure, employer rights. But without it, dismissing the case outright would be an overtly biased ruling, the kind that would attract attention, the kind that would invite scrutiny. And now, thanks to Malia, the courtroom was watching. Lauren seized the opportunity, stepping in with her voice clear and precise. "Your Honor, the contract language is unambiguous. Without supporting documentation, the company has failed to meet its own stated conditions for termination. This is a direct breach of contract." Judge Randolph didn't look at her. He was still looking at Whitmore. He was weighing his options, calculating the fallout of every possible move he could make from here. He had spent years playing this game, years knowing how to maneuver around inconvenient truths, how to give just enough legal justification to make his rulings appear neutral. But today he was cornered. Whitmore seemed to realize it at the same moment. His shoulders were a fraction stiffer, his fingers curling against his notes as if he could will them into containing the evidence he needed. He could argue that employer discretion should take precedence, but that argument would collapse under its own weight. The company had made the rules. The company had broken them. The tension stretched so thin it felt like a wire about to snap. Then, finally, Randolph leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the bench. "Counselor Whitmore," he said slowly, "are you telling this court that Redmond Industries chose to include a contractual clause regarding termination requirements and then failed to abide by it?" There it was. The first crack in the foundation. Whitmore swallowed once, then squared his shoulders. "Your Honor, the clause in question does not specify the exact nature of documentation required. It is subject to reasonable interpretation." Randolph let out a breath that was almost a sigh. It was an excuse, a weak one, and everyone in the room knew it. Malia didn't say anything, didn't move, didn't react. She didn't need to. The damage had already been done. Judge Randolph tapped a finger once against the bench, his gaze flickering back to Lauren, then to Malia. For the first time, there was no dismissiveness in his expression, no amusement, only consideration. A shift had occurred, irreversible now. and Malia knew they were winning. The courtroom had changed. The quiet confidence that had hovered over James Whitmore since the trial began had started to unravel. The tension in his jaw, the way his fingers tapped slightly faster against his papers, the stiffness in his posture, it all revealed what he hadn't yet admitted aloud. Control was slipping through his hands. The judge's neutrality, or at least the illusion of it, had been compromised, and he knew exactly who had done it. Malia remained still, watching the pieces fall into place. She knew this moment well. It was the moment when those in power realized they had underestimated the person sitting across from them. It was the moment when a case that was supposed to be routine, predictable, predetermined, suddenly became a real fight. She had seen it in political debates, in media scandals, in corporate cover-ups exposed too late to be contained. Judge Randolph leaned back slightly, fingers tapping against his bench in measured contemplation. He had spent decades maneuvering around inconvenient truths, dressing bias and legal jargon, ensuring rulings favored those who expected to win. But now, his own words were being used against him, his past rulings laid bare for the courtroom to see. And worst of all, there was an audience watching. The interns in the back had stopped whispering. The reporters in the gallery had adjusted their cameras, their pens scratching faster against their notebooks. The corporate representatives who had come expecting a swift, favorable ruling were shifting in their seats, exchanging nervous glances. Randolph exhaled through his nose, shifting his gaze back to Whitmore. "Counselor," he said, his voice measured, "you have stated that Redmond Industries had no obligation to provide documentation. However, the contract explicitly states the termination must be based on substantiated cause with supporting documentation. That language is not ambiguous." Whitmore straightened. He wasn't giving up, not yet. His mind was moving fast, recalculating. His voice was steady when he spoke. "Your Honor, if we begin interpreting every contractual clause as an absolute limitation on employer discretion, we set a dangerous precedent. Businesses must be able to operate efficiently without the burden of excessive documentation for routine personnel decisions." Malia didn't move, but internally she noted the shift in his strategy. He was abandoning the argument that the clause was ambiguous. He was now arguing that enforcing the clause would be impractical, unreasonable. It was a desperate pivot. Judge Randolph's lips pressed together in something between thoughtfulness and irritation. "So, you're saying the company created a contractual requirement it had no intention of following?" A ripple went through the room. Whitmore clenched his jaw before offering a carefully measured response. "I'm saying, Your Honor, that the intent of the contract should be considered as much as the wording." Lauren Brooks, who had remained poised despite the relentless roadblocks throughout the case, finally spoke. Her voice was sharp, precise. "And what exactly was the intent, Counselor? To include a clause for legal appearances but ignore it when inconvenient?" Whitmore barely looked at her. His attention remained on Randolph, as if willing the judge to steer this back in his favor. But the cracks were too deep now. Malia finally spoke, her tone even. "The law does not allow for selective enforcement, Your Honor. Either the clause is binding, or it isn't. And if it isn't, then what is the purpose of a contract at all?" The room held its breath. The words weren't shouted, weren't dramatic, but they carried weight. They echoed the thoughts already forming in the minds of those watching. Judge Randolph's fingers tapped once against the bench. He was backed into a corner, forced to acknowledge what he had spent the entire trial avoiding. If he ruled against Janice Harper now, After everything that had been exposed, it wouldn't just be a ruling. It would be a statement. A declaration that contracts were meaningless if the employer was powerful enough to ignore them. The weight of that realization settled over the courtroom. Whitmore inhaled, preparing another argument, but it was too late. The momentum had shifted too far. Randolph exhaled. "Miss Brooks, Miss Obama," he said, his voice carrying a different tone now, measured, deliberate. "I must admit, I had not anticipated such a thorough dissection of this case." Malia didn't react. She didn't need to. She knew what was coming next. The judge straightened his robe slightly, then turned back to Whitmore. "Counselor, the defense has presented compelling evidence that your client failed to meet the contractual requirements of the termination. Do you have any documented proof that supports your client's claim that the termination met the required standard?" Whitmore's lips parted, but no words came. He was calculating, stalling, searching for something, anything, to salvage his case. But there was nothing left. The silence stretched too long. Judge Randolph let out a slow breath and nodded, his decision already made. And just like that, the case had turned. The sound of the gavel striking the bench echoed through the silent courtroom. Judge Randolph's voice carried a weight that had not been present earlier in the trial. Stripped of its earlier dismissiveness, now edged with reluctant finality. The ruling was clear. Redmond Industries had breached their own contract. The plaintiff, Janice Harper, was entitled to financial compensation. The corporation was now liable for damages. For a moment, no one moved. The decision landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, its ripples spreading outward as realization set in. The gallery, which had entered expecting a swift ruling in favor of Redmond, now found itself witness to something far more significant. This was not just a corporate dispute. It was a legal turning point. A statement against the unchecked power of employers who thought contracts were merely suggestions rather than obligations. Lauren Brooks exhaled slowly, absorbing the victory with the quiet composure of someone who had fought long enough to know that celebration came second to ensuring the ruling held. Malia remained still, her posture unchanged, her expression neutral. This wasn't the time to revel in the moment. She knew how these battles worked. Winning in court was one thing, but controlling the narrative that followed was another. Across the aisle, James Whitmore was already shifting in his seat, his face unreadable, but the way he gathered his papers with slightly too much precision betrayed his irritation. He had come expecting an easy win, a routine dismissal. Instead, he had been forced into a corner, exposed, and ultimately defeated in a case that should never have gotten this far. His jaw tightened, his fingers curling against the edge of his notes as he straightened, adjusting his tie with forced composure. Judge Randolph cleared his throat, looking directly at Whitmore now. "Counselor, given the ruling, the court will reconvene to determine the appropriate damages owed to the plaintiff. I trust your client will comply accordingly." It was not a question. Whitmore's nod was almost imperceptible. He was already planning his next move, weighing his options, considering whether an appeal was worth the risk of further exposing Redmond's legal vulnerabilities. But he knew, everyone in the room knew, that the damage had already been done. The judge turned to Lauren and Malia. "Miss Brooks, Miss Obama, I trust you'll provide the necessary documentation for the damages hearing." Lauren nodded, already prepared. "Of course, Your Honor." Randolph hesitated just slightly before returning his gaze to Malia, as if seeing her in a new light. The shift was subtle but undeniable. He had spent the trial dismissing her, underestimating her, believing she was just another voice in the courtroom that could be ignored. But now he understood. She wasn't just a name, wasn't just an observer. She had forced this shift, had dismantled the careful legal maneuvering designed to silence this case. His lips pressed together, and for the first time, his tone carried something that almost resembled grudging respect. "You'll do well in this field, Miss Obama." Malia met his gaze, her expression unreadable. She could have pointed out that she wasn't in this field, that she wasn't a lawyer, that she had no intention of becoming one, but she knew what he meant. "I do my best, Your Honor." The courtroom began to stir. The murmurs started softly at first, the quiet hum of shifting perspectives, of conversations that would be carried beyond these walls. Some of the junior associates who had come expecting a lesson in corporate legal dominance now looked at her differently. The legal interns in the back exchanged glances, some taking final notes, others simply absorbing what they had just witnessed. Reporters were already whispering into their recorders, drafting headlines in their minds. A major corporation losing a contract dispute was news on its own, but the presence of her, that changed the narrative entirely. Malia could already predict the coverage. Some would frame it as a landmark case for employee rights, while others would focus on her involvement, reducing the legal victory to a spectacle of political legacy rather than legal merit. She was used to it. She gathered her notes with the same quiet efficiency she had carried throughout the trial, knowing that the real work was just beginning. The courtroom was only one battleground. The court of public opinion, the corporate boardrooms already calculating their damage control, the legal firms now reevaluating their own contracts, those were the next fronts. As she stepped out into the courthouse hallway, the crisp afternoon air meeting her skin, she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. "Quite the performance in there." James Whitmore's voice was as smooth as ever, but there was an edge beneath it now, something sharper than before. She turned, meeting his gaze, noting the careful way he adjusted his cufflinks, as if grounding himself in the familiar routine of composure. "I wasn't performing," she said simply. "I was presenting the law." His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "You do realize that making judges look foolish isn't exactly a sustainable strategy." She tilted her head slightly. "I wasn't trying to make him look foolish. He did that on his own." For the first time, a flicker of something else crossed his face. Frustration, acknowledgement, maybe even a reluctant respect. He exhaled through his nose, nodding once. "Don't expect all judges to take it as well as he did." "I don't expect anything," she said. "I prepare for everything." Whitmore let out a short breath, something close to a laugh, but not quite. "Good answer." Then, without another word, he turned, disappearing down the courthouse steps. She watched him go, knowing this wouldn't be the last time she encountered men like him. The names would change, the cases would shift, but the fight itself, that was constant. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, seeing a message from Lauren. "Case dismissed. Employer is liable. We'll discuss damages next week." A second message came in almost immediately. "You're incredible. Thank you." Malia exhaled, the weight of the trial finally settling as she pocketed her phone and took a moment to just be. The victory was won, but the war wasn't over. It never was. She started down the courthouse steps, her heels clicking against the stone, her mind already shifting to the next battle she hadn't yet seen coming. But now, no one would dare underestimate her again. If you enjoyed this, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's next. Check out more videos for similar stories and share this one with others who might find it interesting.